Welcome everybody. My name is Bill Flynn. I'm the Executive Director of the New Canaan Nature Center in New Canaan, Connecticut. And we're happy to host this presentation tonight with one of the world's most renowned birders and illustrators, Mr. David Allen Sibley. And we're gonna just first quickly thank our community partners who helped with this presentation tonight. The New Canaan Library is hosting the Zoom. And thank you, Lisa Oldham, their executive director, Anthony Maricola, who's actually on the Zoom right now. Thank you both for all your work and helping with the registrations. Also, Elm Street Books and Susan Ryan, our local bookstore here. They are managing the book sales for this event for the book that David will be talking about shortly, and what it's like to be a bird. Please go on and purchase a copy of the book. It's an outstanding book. One of the things David's most famous for is his illustrations, and they're beautiful, as he will share shortly. Don't go on Amazon.com to get the book. Go on ElmStreetBooks.com so that you can support your local bookstore, and so you can get the book plate that comes with it, which is also created by Mr. Sibley. So your official introduction. You ready? Yes, we're good. We're really happy to introduce David Allen Sibley, is the author and illustrator of a series of successful guides to nature that bear his name, including the Sibley Guide to Birds. He's contributed to the publications of the Smithsonian Science Magazine, the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, Birding, Bird Watching, North American Birds, and the New York Times. He's a recipient of the Roger Tory Peterson Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Birding Association and the Linnaean Society of New York's Eisenmann Medal. Currently lives in Birds in Massachusetts. Welcome, Mr. David Allen Sibley.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to Hedwig for introducing.
Yeah, we were supposed to do this in April for a live presentation. Obviously, COVID-19 changed those plans. So just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Yeah.
We were talking yesterday, because the first portion of our presentation is an interview with us, and one of the questions I had was what bird you have the most, or feel the most connection with, and one of them was owls. And so we figured we'd start there, and can you explain to everyone why you feel that connection, and why are people drawn to owls in general, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think owls, I've always loved owls, and they're a real challenge to draw because they're so different from other birds in so many ways. Their eyes on the front of the head, different head shape, a very sort of flat face, the bill doesn't stick out at all. So everything that you know about drawing birds, most of it isn't very useful when you're drawing owls. They're so different, and then they're just so elusive. It's always a treat to see an owl because they're mainly active at night and not very common, not very numerous. So it's just always exciting to see one. And then I think people in general respond to owls because they have a very human-like face with the eyes on the front of the head and a bill, sort of the shape of the face, sort of like their bill is our nose and the two eyes facing forward. And they're so, what's the word, kind of impenetrable. They sit there, they sit there and stare with sort of a knowing expression, or a kind of a superior expression on their face, and slowly turn their head and just take everything in. It looks like they're kind of taking everything in and judging and figuring things out.
Well, she's judging me right now.
There's a lot of, a lot of anthropomorphizing that you can do just based on the way the owl looks. But they're just such fascinating birds and so different. So I think all of those things make them just really fun.
So one of the, one of the most common owls you can actually see during the day are barred owls. So if you do have a better chance. I mean, I hear them during the day much more often than any others. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna give Hedwig the rest of the night off and continue on with our interview section of this presentation, and then we'll get into your presentation. So
All right.
everyone, Hedwig will wave goodbye. There he goes. That's his trick. All right, you're done. All right. So really, I wanted to start so people, not to take away from what you're going to talk about in your book, but more just getting to know you. Your origins of your career as an ornithologist and an artist, where are you from, and what was it in your childhood that really got you going down this career path?
Yeah, it was, well, my father's an ornithologist, so that that obviously had a lot to do with it. The house was full of bird books. When people came over to visit, they were interested in birds and talking about birds. And when I was first, I loved to draw when I was very young, and my favorite subject was birds. And I would take my father's bird books off the shelf and trace and copy pictures out of those books. And at that time, we lived in California, and he was studying California condors. And things happened when, you know, if anyone listening is the child of a biologist, you know what happens when your parent's a biologist. Things come home. So one day a California condor came home. A young condor had kind of blundered out of its nest and on its first couple of flights and landed right near the elementary school that I went to. So my father and a couple of his coworkers went to find it, and it spent the night in our garage. And that condor is Topa Topa, who is he's the first condor in captivity, still alive.
Wow.
And so anyway, that kind of experience was really formative for me, that, you know, coming home from school and finding that there's a condor in the garage, and lots of opportunities to study birds, to do bird banding, to interact with people about birds. When I was in 4th grade, we moved to Connecticut, and I grew up in Guilford, or I did 4th grade through high school in Guilford, and birding with the New Haven Bird Club, you know, Milford Point, Hammonasset, that whole stretch of coast, and had just great experiences and a lot of really good mentors in that area. So I say I grew up in Connecticut. Connecticut's my home state. And I've lived in Massachusetts now for about 20 years. In between, I lived all over the country. California, I spent a lot of time traveling in a camper van, and then spent about 15 years at Cape May, New Jersey. So that's my, but yeah, I think when I look back, I think that obviously my father had a big influence, but the thing, he didn't take us out birding. He didn't say, hey, come on, let's go look for birds. He just said, let's go for a hike. And if it was him and a couple of his friends, someone would be turning over logs and finding mole crickets and snakes, and someone else would be picking leaves and flowers and handing them to us and saying, here, try this. It was just sort of a naturalist education, and just spending a lot of time outside, I think, was the key. And I started noticing things and learning, understanding the whole natural system. It made sense to me, and the more I learned, the more interesting it got.
Well, I think especially right now, people have, if anything came out of this coronavirus situation, is that people really appreciated getting back outside, and reestablishing that, or establishing for the first time. So hopefully more people can gain that connection. For those people that are not birders and want to get into it, or the people that might be birders that want to improve their skills, I mean, obviously besides buying, you know, what it's like to be a bird and Sibley bird guides, what would be the next step of increasing their skills or getting into it?
Um, yeah, having a field guide is really important, so you can learn the names of the birds, and that once you know the name, that opens the door to learning all kinds of other things about that bird. And the advice that I give, one thing that I think is most important and I think often overlooked, is that once you have the field guide, you should spend some time with it at home, just browsing through the pages and maybe marking the species that are found in your area. That's a good exercise to go through the book. Spend a couple of hours just going through the book and marking all the species that are expected in your area. And that way, if you've never birded before, if you've never looked at a field guide before, there's names like vireo and warbler and scoter, names like that will be very unfamiliar. And
Right.
and just beginning to learn the patterns, the groups of birds is important. So learning what makes a thrush, how a thrush is different from a wren, how they're different from sparrows and warblers and orioles, and starting to recognize those bigger patterns, I think, is really a key to understanding the birds. And then you'll get a lot more out of it. When you see a new species of sparrow, it'll make sense how it fits in with all the others. So you need that context. And I think a good way to get that is just to spend some time browsing through the field guide at home before you've even seen a bird. The other key is just spending time outdoors and go out and watch birds, and gradually you will figure them out.
So of all of this birding experience, you've been all over the world. Any particularly memorable experiences, either a place or an experience that really was rewarding for you?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by bird migration. That's the thing that has always excited me most, is seeing birds on the move, waking up one morning and suddenly there are birds in your yard that weren't there the day before. And so I've always gravitated to places where there was a lot of migration, visible migration. And so Cape May, New Jersey is really the best place, I think, year-round, the single best place in North America to watch bird migration. It's just incredible what happens there. And the state of New Jersey is the southern tip of New Jersey, where Cape May is sort of shaped like a funnel, and birds, when they're migrating south, they don't like to fly over water. The land birds obviously don't like to fly over water, so they're funneled as they move south through New Jersey. They're funneled right to the tip of Cape May, and you can sit there at the tip of Cape May, and on any day from mid-August through mid-November, you can see 100 species of birds without moving, just sitting in one spot and watching the birds that pass by. You'll see 100 species, and there'll be different ones every day, surprises. And some days, huge numbers of one species, and the next day, huge numbers of another species. One of my most memorable all-time bird experiences was one morning there in October in the early 90s. And I woke up before sunrise. It was still pretty dark, and stepped outside, as I usually would just step outside and listen to get a sense of what had happened overnight, how many new birds had come in, what was moving, what the day was going to be like. And that morning I stepped outside, and all I heard were great blue herons. Just lots and lots of great blue heron calls coming from the sky above. And as it got light, you could make out shapes. And there were great blue herons flying in squadrons, in lines, like 10 or 15 birds in a line.
And multiple lines?
Yeah, some just 100 yards up, some 500 feet up, 1,000 feet up, 2,000 feet up. You'd look up at the sky, and it was just milling layers of great blue herons overhead. There were over 3,000 in the air at once.
That's
When it
awesome.
got light enough and we got into position to actually see a big section of the sky and count them all, the estimate was over 3,000 great blue herons, essentially all in the air at once.
Is that something that's been repeated, or is that
No,
you've never seen anything like that since?
no, the second highest single day count at Cape May was, I think, in the mid 200s, 250 or so. So it's more than 10 times higher than any other single day count there. And there's been nothing like it since, and nothing, I've never heard of anything like that anywhere else in North America. So
Well,
it was just an incredible day.
I'm
And they all dropped down into the trees and around the ponds. Some of them moved on, but a lot, 1,500 or so probably dropped in all day long. Wherever you walked through the woods, you'd be flushing great blue herons out of the trees. And in the evening, about 1,500 got up and circled and headed south.
I don't think most people are, the New Jersey Tourism Association is going to thank you. So now everyone's going to flood down to Jersey to go see what you saw. So I'll send them a note. Just one last question before you give your presentation is for people who are listening who aren't birders, who maybe this is a new conversation for them. What are they missing? Why should they take an interest? What can they get out of it that they're missing out on?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about the appeal of birding, and I mean, it means a lot to me. I've never not been a birder, so but I mean, there's the beauty of the birds themselves, the sort of aesthetic appeal of watching them and listening to them. There's the excitement, that kind of treasure hunt, scavenger hunt chase of going out and trying to find a rare species, find a new species you've never seen before. And there are specific times and places that you'll learn where is the best place and time to see each species. So there's that aspect. But I've come to think that the real appeal of birding is just kind of understanding nature, getting connected with nature. That we now are some of the first generations that have grown up insulated from nature. We can live our whole lives in a city, in air conditioning, in cars, and have very little contact with nature. Our grandparents and great-grandparents, most of them lived in the country on farms and knew a lot of birds, understood the cycles and what happens, what to expect on March 15th and March 30th and April 15th. And we've lost touch with that, but I think it's sort of an instinctive desire to understand it, or it feels good to know what's going on, to be connected to that. So birdwatching gives us kind of an excuse or a reason, a superficial reason to set the alarm for 5 in the morning and go out somewhere and walk around, and we'll see some birds. But the deeper reward is just watching the sunrise, and maybe you'll see a fox, and if you do that, if you're going out regularly, you'll see the foliage change. You'll see the trees leaf out, the flowering maples early in the spring before the leaves. All these things that you begin to understand just by spending time outdoors. And I think that's really the thing that makes birding fundamentally appealing, is just, it's an opportunity to, it's an entry point, a kind of a hook, and a really accessible and kind of bite-sized chunk of nature that you can get into and learn about. And as you learn about birds, you start to understand all these bigger patterns, and you get a sense of the change of seasons and the rhythm of migration and the cycles of insects and plants and all these other things. I think that's what birding is really all about at its core.
Well, you basically just did an infomercial for why places like the New Canaan Nature Center exist. I mean, it's establishing that connection, and then breeds to love, and love comes to the protection and the environmentalism later. So thank you for providing that avenue.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass it off to you. The one thing I'm gonna say is, for everyone, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a Q&A button. We're gonna do a Q&A session at the end after Mr. Sibley does his presentation. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Try to make them unique and interesting. If you asked what his favorite bird is, it probably won't make it to the session, but please, anytime during the presentation, submit your questions there. And my formal handoff is enjoy the presentation from one of the most world celebrated ornithologists and artists. His new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, From Flying to Nesting, Eating to Singing, What Birds Are Doing and Why. Everyone, Mr. David Allen Sibley. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I will share my screen and show you some PowerPoint slides of the book and talk a little bit about what's in the book. So I hope you can see the slide now. A chimney swift. Oops. Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, David, we can see it. You're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's telling me it's paused, but all right, I'll go ahead. Oops. So this book the idea for this book first started about almost 20 years ago. And it started as an idea for a children's book or just a guide for beginners, a beginner's guide to birds. So I wanted to introduce people to all of the most familiar backyard birds, the species that you might see around your house, around your neighborhood. And also I wanted to answer a lot of the common questions that I heard from my birding and non-birding friends. I wanted to include that information on the amazing abilities and adaptations of birds, to explain a little bit more about what the birds are doing beyond just how to identify them. And part of as the book went on, as I did the research to answer those questions and to include all the little fun facts, I was learning so much, and the things that I was learning were so amazing. A lot of things that I thought I knew turned out to be wrong. And the truth, the real answer was so much more impressive and more interesting than what I thought I knew. That information was so interesting and so extensive that I decided that would be the entire book. So it turned into more of a collection of short essays, very short little blurbs about all of these interesting adaptations and abilities and senses of the birds. And it still introduces all of the common species, but there's nothing about identification. But some of the holdovers from the original idea as a children's book, I knew I wanted to have really big, colorful, action-packed illustrations. And I came up with the idea of illustrating all of the primary species life size, which in an 8.5 by 11 book, that means for the large species, you're only going to see a small part of the bird. But that was a really fun challenge to try to illustrate those species and fit them onto an 8.5 by 11 page. This chimney swift, I was trying to illustrate the feeling of living in the air, that chimney swifts essentially live in the air. They only come down to roost and cling to a vertical wall, like inside a chimney, or sometimes a tree trunk inside a hollow tree. Otherwise, they're spending all of their time in the air. And it's possible that they spend the entire winter in the air. Nobody knows for sure, but some other swifts have been confirmed recently as spending the entire winter flying. They migrate from North America to South America, and at least from August or September until April or May when they come back, they are flying the entire time. So that's the feeling I was trying to capture with this chimney swift painting, flying high above the earth. I also wanted to show each species at its best. So this double-crested cormorant, it's not a species that most people would think of as a beautiful bird, but they're very elegant and very ornamented, especially in their courtship colors and breeding season, like this bird. So I wanted to really show off the beauty of every species. And among the questions that I tried to answer in the book was fun questions like this. Who would win a race between a roadrunner and a coyote? And I added a few more competitors. And the answer you can see from the illustration. There's a little more explanation in the book, but the coyote would beat the roadrunner, even without any mail order rocket packs or any extra help. And I said that along the way, I learned really amazing, surprising things. One of the first things I learned as I started researching was just how amazing feathers are. And we all know the expression like water off a duck's back. Feathers are water repellent. And for my whole life, all of my birding career, I thought that feathers were water repellent because of the oil that birds preen into them. Birds have a special gland on their body near their tail, and when they're preening, they rub their bill against that gland and get a little bit of oil on their bill, and then rub that oil onto their feathers. And I had always assumed that it was the oil that made the water bead up and roll off of the feathers, that the oil was the water repellent thing. But it turns out that the feathers are waterproof, water repellent because of their structure. The spacing of the barbs on the feather is just right so that the feather acts like Gore-Tex.
David, I need to interrupt you for a second. The slide is still on the first turn.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we didn't see the illustration from the cormorant to the roadrunner to the. I can see the slides on the side. It just wasn't advancing. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. Well, let me try again.
Okay.
Oops.
Yes. Now we're on. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll go back to the swift, and then you can see the cormorant.
Thank you.
Oh, so here I was talking about the beauty of the cormorant, and all you could see was a swift. So there's the beautiful cormorant, and oops, now it's not. There's the hypothetical race between the coyote, the roadrunner, and a few other competitors. And the water off a duck's back. And so the thing with the feathers is that the spacing of the barbs is precisely calibrated so that a drop of water, which is held together by its surface tension, a drop of water can't get small enough to go through the spaces in the barbs on the feather. And here's a diagram of how that works. There's a feather on the left and then a magnified cross-section of some of the barbs on the right with a drop of water resting on top of the barbs. And you can see how the droplet of water, it's too big to go through the spaces between the barbs. But because it's resting on the ridges on top of the barbs, it's only making contact across a very small surface area, and it doesn't stick to the barbs, it just rolls off. So that's the main reason that feathers are waterproof and water repellent, is because of the structure, the spacing of the barbs. And the oil, I'm sure it helps to keep the water from sticking to the barbs, but it's the spacing that really makes them waterproof. And it turns out that the spacing of the barbs varies between species, because a diving duck, like a surf scoter, is going deep underwater where there's higher pressure and water can be forced through the feathers under pressure. So they have the barbs closer together so that the water won't be forced through under pressure. But that means that the drop of water is making contact with the surface of more barbs and sticks to the feathers a little more easily. A land bird, in contrast, has the barbs spaced farther apart. It has no need to protect against water under pressure, so it can have the barbs farther apart, and that way a drop of water just barely makes contact with a few barbs and rolls off really easily. But the spaces between the barbs are still small enough so that a drop of water can't flow through. So if you have a microscope and a good measuring device, you can look at any feather and tell whether that's a land bird or a swimming bird that doesn't dive underwater or a diving bird. They all have different spacing between the barbs, adapted to how they need to protect against water. And is this slide changing? Can you see the killdeer now?
Yep, you're good, David.
Okay. So another amazing thing that I learned was this is a killdeer. It's a ground nesting bird, and like all the ground nesting birds, they rely on camouflage to protect their eggs and their nest. So they don't really build a nest. They just lay their eggs in the open on the ground. And the eggs are cryptically colored to blend in with the gravel or whatever substrate they're on. And the bird is cryptically patterned in this sort of disruptive camouflage, so it's difficult to make out the outline of the bird, and they rely on that camouflage to avoid being discovered. But if you think about it, that kind of camouflage, it's visual camouflage. It works in the daytime for things like hawks and other predators that are hunting by sight. But a lot of predators come out at night and wander around, like skunks and foxes. They wander around hunting by smell. So it turns out that the killdeer and other ground nesting birds are protected against those predators because their preen oil, the oil they preen into their feathers, changes its chemical composition in the breeding season to an oil that is odorless, that mammals can't smell. And that so the regular preen oil has an odor, but for a few months during the breeding season, killdeer, ducks, grouse, they all change to an odorless chemical for their preen oil. And the researchers tested this by putting samples of the regular preen oil and the breeding season preen oil, distributing them in a warehouse, a big open space, and releasing some hunting dogs in the room. And the hunting dogs found all of the regular preen oil, but walked right past the breeding season preen oil and did not detect it. So these birds, they're camouflaged visually in the daytime, and they're camouflaged by smell for all of the predators that hunt by smell. And this, like most of these things that I learned, it also just brings up more questions. And one of the questions that people often ask when I tell them this story is that why don't the birds use that preen oil all the time? It seems like a really good idea to be odorless. Why not be odorless year round? And as far as I know, that has not been studied, and nobody really knows why they change from one preen oil to the other. I can think of some simple explanations. Maybe the breeding season preen oil doesn't protect the feathers as well, or some other. There's maybe other advantages, but as far as I know, nobody's studied it. So it's a really good subject for a project for anyone who's wants to research that. And like I tried to make the point throughout the book also, where there are so many things unknown, even about really common birds. I've already mentioned the chimney swift. It's a common bird in Eastern North America, but nobody really knows what they do all winter. Do they fly all the time, or do they land? And the killdeer, it's nesting in towns all over Connecticut, around parking lots and playing fields. But questions like the preen oil are still waiting to be answered. And bird vision is also just really remarkable and really varied. If you tuned in early, you heard me talking about the owl's vision, or birds in general. They process images more quickly than we do, and I'll get back to that in a second. But this is a snipe, and snipe use their vision primarily to monitor their surroundings for predators. So they have eyes on the sides of their head, like most birds, but even more completely opposite sides of the head. So snipe can see 360 degrees around them all the time without moving, and they can see 180 degrees overhead. They see the entire sky and the entire horizon all the time without moving. And where we see, well, both of our eyes face in the same direction, and we see one spot of detail with each eye, and both eyes focus on the same point. So what we see is one point of detail and about 180 degrees of peripheral vision. The snipe is seeing 360 degrees of peripheral vision, and instead of seeing a small point of detail, they see a band of detail along the entire horizon. So they can monitor their surroundings with their peripheral vision. They can detect motion and see changes around them. And then in that band of detail along the horizon, they can see a little bit more of what's going on. And since snipe, like the killdeer, they rely on their camouflage. They rely on cryptic coloration for protection. So when danger threatens, the snipe's first reaction is just to crouch and freeze and hold perfectly still and let its camouflage work to protect it. And while they're doing that, holding perfectly still, they can still see everything that's happening around them and keep an eye on any predator that might be approaching, so they know when it's time to fly or do something else to escape. And one of the trade-offs is that they can't see the tip of their bill. They actually don't see very well straight ahead, and they can't see the tip of their bill, and they don't use vision for foraging much at all. They're foraging by the sense of touch and taste and smell, and using their bill. They have taste buds and touch sensors in the tip of their bill. So as they're sticking their bill into the mud, they can tell what's there just by feel. They don't need vision for that. And at the same time, their eyes are busy monitoring what's around them. Stepping away from vision for a second, just to explain what's going on when a sandpiper sticks its bill into the mud. The tip of their bill is very sensitive to touch and sensitive to pressure. So when a sandpiper sticks its bill into the mud or sand, water is forced away. Water is displaced by the bill. And the water has to move away to make room for the bill. And as it moves away, it'll flow smoothly through mud or sand, but if there's something that blocking its flow, like a clam or a rock, the sandpiper can detect the slightly higher pressure there, where the water is squeezed between the bird's bill and that non-porous object. So every time a sandpiper sticks its bill into the mud, if it's lucky, it actually bumps into something, but it can detect when there's something interesting nearby and what direction that's in. So it can make its next probe into the mud or sand with some information about where that might be profitable. And then once it sticks its bill in and actually finds the thing that it detected by pressure, it can use the taste buds and touch sensors and in the tip of its bill to tell whether that's a clam or a rock and whether it's worth pulling out. So there's a whole lot going on. They're getting a pretty good picture of what's under the mud every time they stick their bill in. It's not just a blind sort of sticking their bill in and hoping they hit something. And they're not using vision much at all for that. Their eyes, like the snipe, they're monitoring their surroundings for predators and foraging by touch and taste. Now the eagle has a very different visual system from the snipe, and as a bird that hunts by sight, they use their vision to find food and track it. They have a very different visual system. So they still have eyes on the sides of their head. They can see almost 360 degrees around, and each eye points in a different direction, but each eye sees 2 points of detail. So with their eyes pointing in different directions, the eagle is simultaneously seeing 4 spots of detail at all times. They don't see very well straight ahead, just like the snipe. And when they want to look at something and study it in detail, they turn their head to study it with one eye. So the portrait of the eagle on the left here is actually giving you its full attention. It is studying you intently with one eye. And that's the pose that a bird takes when it is studying something with great interest. They don't look directly at something that they're interested in because they can't see very well straight ahead. They use one eye and turn their head to focus that eye on their object of interest. And this is what robins are doing when they're hunting on your lawn, and they tilt their head and it seems like they're listening. We interpret it as listening for worms, but they're actually looking with one eye, tilting their head so that they can aim that spot of detail at one point on the ground. And they do that with one eye at a time. So robins are hunting visually, looking for activity in the little dirt mounds that the earthworms push up. And when they see movement, when they see activity in one of those dirt mounds, they jump forward and plunge their bill into the dirt and grab the worm that's near the surface. But they're hunting visually. They're not using their ears for hunting. And the other adaptation for bird vision is they process images more quickly than we do. So what that means is that they're seeing faster, essentially. So we process visual images at something under 30 images per second, 30 frames per second. So all of our movies and videos rely on that and show us a series of images at about 30 frames per second. We can't process the image quickly enough to distinguish it. So they all blur together and we see a moving picture. But birds can process images much faster than we can, and some species more than twice as fast. The flycatchers are the fastest processing that has been tested, and they process visual images at about 70 images per second, so more than twice as fast as we do. So presumably when they're watching a computer screen or watching a television, one of our videos, they would see it as a series of still images. They would actually be able to process the images quickly enough to see each one separately before the next one appears. And what this adaptation is critical for, why they can do this, is for high-speed flight. Like these hummingbirds, the things hummingbirds do around a garden, around hummingbird feeders are just amazing. Flying 20 miles an hour and dodging and weaving between plants and everything from Cooper's hawks to song sparrows, they can all fly very quickly through tangled vegetation. They see all the approaching obstacles clearly, not in a blur like we would, but they see them all clearly, so they can adjust their flight and move around the obstacles. And this visual processing is really critical for their ability to fly through obstacles. So I've talked mostly about sort of physical adaptations and senses, but birds also are really smart and innovative. They learn, they adapt, and a lot of that is really impressive as well. And these ring-billed gulls are infamous for eating garbage, literally. They'll hang around at the beach and eat any scraps of food they can that they can steal. They'll visit the garbage dump and rummage around for old chicken bones and other discarded food and eat that. But when a gull is feeding its young in the nest, the adult gull will go to the garbage dump to find food for itself. But after it's gotten a meal for itself, it will go out into the ocean and catch fresh fish or crabs or some other really high quality natural food and bring that back for its chicks. They're very particular and very conscientious about what they feed to their young. And chickadees also, I mean, chickadees have some amazing abilities. They can remember tens of thousands of storage locations where they take bird seeds from your bird feeder and stash them in crevices in tree bark all over the woods. And they can remember tens of thousands of different locations and some information about what's stored in each location, whether it's higher quality or lower quality. And just like the gulls, when the chickadees are feeding their young, they don't feed their young sunflower seeds, even though the adults might be visiting the bird feeder to get seeds for themselves. They find caterpillars and insects. They especially like the little green inchworms. And for the first week or so after the young chickadees hatch, the adults bring them a high percentage of spiders. And it turns out spiders are high in taurine, which is an essential nutrient important for brain development. So the chickadees instinctively know that spiders are important, or that spiders are a good thing to feed to their chicks. And they know that the chicks need high quality, high protein food like insects, insect larvae, spiders, and they won't introduce the young to food like sunflower seeds until after the young have fledged. Then they'll bring the family around to the bird feeder and show the young chickadees where they can get an easy meal. But all of this, it's instinctive on the one hand, but it's also, a lot of what birds do is instinctive. Their knowledge and their sense of what they need to do at each season, each week. But at the same time, they're making a lot of decisions. They're weighing lots of different choices. Their instinct is telling them what to do, and then they adapt and adjust and make decisions based on all kinds of other information. I learned, among other things, parrots are some of the smartest birds, although all birds are smart in slightly different ways. But most parrots are left-footed. they favor one side, and most of them favor their left side. And it turns out that parrots that have a more dominant side, that are more strongly left-footed or one-sided, are better at problem solving. And that's apparently the same with humans. And it's thought that the development of sidedness, if you use your left hand, that occupies the right side of your brain, and it leaves the left side of your brain free to do other things. Birds, just like humans that are more strongly sided, are actually better at problem solving and better at innovating. And there's so many things like that, so much intelligence, learning, decision-making, and memory and innovation that I learned about in birds as I researched this book, that I just came away with the certainty that the birds' lives are so much richer and more complex than I ever really imagined. There's a whole lot going on there. And so I had a lot of fun putting this book together, and I hope you have a lot of fun and learn a lot from reading it. And I hope it gives you some sense of what it's like to be a bird.
All right. Thank you so much. That is not the first time I've seen this presentation, and it's always a little different. I always learn new things. So that's just a snapshot of what the book can tell you, and I do own the book. So please, highly recommended you go out and you get a copy. If you're good, we can do some question and answers. People have been asking them. You can still click the Q&A button. Don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many of these as we have you for. So one thing I'm seeing repeated is questions about your artwork. What, watercolors, or what materials, and really your strategy behind capturing the birds so well.
Yeah, so all of the field guide illustrations were done with gouache, which is opaque watercolor. And for these paintings in this book, I used acrylic. I switched to acrylic paint when I did the tree guide about 10 years ago. And it worked much better for the green leaves and the satiny texture of leaves. So I got comfortable painting with acrylics then and started using it for some bird paintings. And I really liked the way it works. And it worked really well for this book, although a lot of these illustrations, I'm using, it's a pencil drawing and a light wash of paint over that. So I'm using the acrylic sort of like watercolors as a light wash, and not so much as a thick paste like acrylics are sometimes used. But these are all painted with acrylic on paper. And one of the things I was trying to accomplish with the artwork in this book was to make it really engaging and accessible. And I think that sketches and a sketchbook style are much more engaging in that way, because it leaves a lot of things out. It leaves a lot of openings for you to kind of engage with the picture and fill in the gaps and kind of complete the picture in your mind. So that was part of the thinking behind using pencil sketches and these sort of colored sketches, colored sketchbook style paintings. And all of that, the foundation of all of it is my time in the field and field sketching. I spend a lot of time outdoors watching birds and sketching, and that's how I learn what the birds look like, what they really, or I learn what they look like by doing the drawings, by the trial and error experience of trying to convert the bird into a two-dimensional drawing on paper. And as I figure that out, that's really the foundation of all of this. So if the drawing isn't right, the painting can't save it. The outline of the bird, the shape, the proportions, the angles all have to be right. Otherwise, the painting won't work. So I say that my field sketching time is really the foundation of all of this. And then when I'm back in the studio, I use that experience and then use photographs for reference to make sure I get all the details of the colors and patterns right. I don't actually remember exactly how all the markings go on each species. So I look at photographs and use a lot of reference material to sort of make sure I'm getting that right. And in the end, it's also I kind of sit back and look at the painting from a few feet away and see if it looks right to me. Sometimes I'll just hang a painting on the wall and leave it there for a week or two. And as I walk in and out of the room, coming back on different days, suddenly I'll notice something that doesn't look quite right and needs to be fixed. So eventually it all comes down to what looks right to me. But photographs are my primary reference material for the details.
Yeah, there's been a few questions coming in of like, don't you have to take pictures? And then one said, actually, you just answered that. But along with that, a lot of people are asking sort of what's your kit that you need to take when you go birding. So people are asking quality. Do you need really quality binoculars? Your camera? Can you get away with your iPhone? And your sketch pad. You know, what's your best tools of the field?
Yeah, for me, I have really good binoculars, but you can get very good binoculars nowadays for a few $100s. And I also carry a telescope and a tripod almost all the time when I'm out in the field. For sketching, it's really critical. It allows me to get so much closer to the birds. I mean, closer through the telescope. So I can watch them from a distance without disturbing them and see them well enough to actually do a sketch. You really have to see a lot of detail to be able to simplify the bird in a sketch. So the closer you can get, the better, and a telescope is really critical for that. So that's a kind of a mandatory part of my sketching equipment. And for field sketching, I just use standard paper, either a pocket notebook or just a clipboard with some regular office paper and a mechanical pencil. I'm just using it to kind of quickly record ideas and practice things.
Do you carry a Sibley bird guide with you?
No, I don't.
No, okay. And for everyone listening, I'm trying to take a lot of questions, sort of squeeze them into one common. A lot of people are asking about sort of what's in their backyard and backyard birding. A few questions about feeders. Do you use them? Do you like to use them? Actually, we had a talk recently, a lot of people on here were on with Doug Ptolemy, who talked a lot about get your native plants in, that'll bring your native caterpillars, then your birds will just come live there. But in the meantime, any advice on your feeders?
Yeah, I do keep bird feeders. I really enjoy them. And I think they're a fantastic way for people to get connected with birds. So many people enjoy birds through feeding that it's really a great way to learn about birds and to be connected to them. We've lately here in Deerfield had a problem with a black bear or two, so bringing the feeders in. I haven't had the feeders out for a few weeks now, but in the book, I actually answer some of those common questions. So there's questions like, do feeders make birds lazy? The answer is no. Birds always get at least 50% of their food from the wild. And if the feeder disappears, birds don't really suffer. They just switch back to natural food.
Okay.
Do feeders keep birds from migrating? No. I think you could make an argument that feeders might help birds migrate sooner because one of the things that keeps birds from migrating is their body condition and their fat load. So if they can build up fat and energy for the next leg of their journey, they'll be gone. And feeders probably help them do that. And a couple of other questions. But yeah, I'm in favor of bird feeding, and I do have feeders. And you mentioned Doug Tallamy. He's got a couple of great books, and he's really made a great case for native plants. And his main fundamental point, and I mention it, I have a paragraph about that in my book also, that native plants are part of the ecosystem here. There's a whole ecosystem of insects that lives in a red oak or a red maple that doesn't live in a Norway maple. The Norway maple in Europe has a lot of insects that live on it, but when you bring a Norway maple to Connecticut, it doesn't support very many species of insects, only a handful, and that doesn't provide much food for the birds. So native plants are the best way to go in your yard to attract birds. And then the corollary of that is that you're putting in native plants to support a good population of insects. So you have to be ready to live with the insects and not spray insecticides to kill all of them. And these would all be, moths and beetles and things that aren't going to do any harm except to the tree. And the birds will take care of them. So, but you have to it's all part of the whole system, the plants and the insects. The insects are what really attracts the birds.
Similar to the feeders, a lot of people are asking about bird boxes. So there's a question about owl boxes, and bluebird boxes are maybe the most popular. There's a lot of questions about how do you make sure a bluebird box is for a bluebird, not something else. What's your overall take on providing housing for the birds as well as the bird feeders? Yeah.
Housing, again, I think it's a great thing. It's a really great way for people to interact with birds. The birds appreciate it. The cavity nesting species have trouble finding nest sites because dead trees tend to be cut down before they develop a whole apartment complex of woodpecker holes in them. So putting out boxes is a really great way to provide nest sites for those birds. And as far as making sure you get the species you want and the birds don't fight over the boxes, there are some strategies for that, but there's a very, very active community of bluebird house landlords. And a lot of information online and in books about those exact questions that come up all the time with the bluebird house people. So I would suggest going there. I know that one of the strategies is to put out multiple houses in a small area, and that way, if a house wren or a tree swallow takes over one of the boxes, it won't. The other boxes will still be available for other species, and the birds usually aren't territorial across species. So the tree swallow will keep away other tree swallows, but it won't mind a bluebird moving in 10 feet away. So that's one of the strategies for making sure you can get the bluebirds into a box. But I would go to the Bluebird Society, some other websites and books and find more information about that.
The next question I'm going to try to lump in, there's a lot of questions about very specific birds that they're seeing. So increase in barn swallows, or a lot of cowbirds in Connecticut they're noticing. Can you just talk a little bit about the fluctuations of different species and really what drives that fluctuation and what you're seeing sort of as
and
changing?
I know from, I moved to Connecticut in 1970, and so 50 years ago. And, in around 1972 or 73, we made a special trip from Guilford to East Haven to see a red-bellied woodpecker that was coming to someone's feeder. There were fewer than 10 records in Connecticut at that time. The red-bellied woodpecker is now one of the most common backyard birds across the whole state. So that's a really dramatic change in a short time, a few decades. And there are lots of other, when I look at the recent results of the New Haven Christmas bird count, and compare that to what I saw when I was doing that Christmas count in the 1970s, it's dramatically different. And a lot of species that you wouldn't think of, or I wouldn't have even noticed or said that they had changed population. Some have gone up, some have gone down. Bonaparte's gull's way down, canvasback's way down, pine siskin way down, wild turkey obviously way up, red-bellied woodpecker, turkey vulture, black vulture. So each species has its own story in a way. There are some broad patterns, but you really have to go species by species to try to explain what's going on. Some of the broad patterns are species that can do well in the suburbs, in suburban habitat, like species like common grackle, wild turkey, now that they've discovered the suburbs, red-bellied woodpecker, Carolina wren, all those species are doing very well. And species that rely on brushy or sort of hedgerow or grassland habitat are doing very poorly because the habitat has mostly disappeared just because of land use changes. Farms have turned into housing developments or forest, and species like bobolink and meadowlark and field sparrow and towhee are much less common now than they were 50 years ago. The same time, species that really like forest, like pileated woodpecker, is much more common now than it was 50 years ago. So there's a lot of trends all around, and a lot of species increasing, an equal number of species decreasing. There's definitely cause for concern, and a lot of, the best thing we can do for birds is preserve habitat. And part of that, a small part of that is providing habitat in your yard. The bigger part is really protecting parks and natural areas and leaving them, managing them for birds, for the species that are struggling. So
well,
that's a big subject.
It's again, there was so many questions about individual species. I was trying to sort of, get a more broad answer. Yeah, a lot of people are asking very specific species questions, and a couple of resources. You've got certainly the book you can purchase, and maybe you'd find a few answers in there. I think it's a great place to end on the best way you can help these birds, and if you want to see more, is protecting your open space. Our local land trust is really great at that. There's a bird sanctuary actually being restored for its 100th year anniversary in town, called Bristow Bird Sanctuary. So that's another thing local communities doing. And the pollinator pathways are really big in local communities of, go buy your milkweed plants and go, you can participate in this effort. So I think that's a great place to end our discussion about what everyone on this call can go do to help your birds. If you want to learn more, please, again, Elm Street Books, and purchase What It's Like to Be a Bird. It's a phenomenal book. And Mr. Sibley, I can't thank you enough for joining us. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but now you just have to hop onto another one of his talks and see if you can answer it.
All right, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Again, thanks to the library for hosting our Zoom. And thanks for joining the New Canaan Nature Center for this presentation. We'll have to invite you down for the opening of the bird sanctuary in a few years.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There you go. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.